It's a rather complicated question, actually, to unpack. And so what I'm going to do here is take it in three different pieces. First, let me address the Hindu part, and then I'll address the minority part, and then I'll deal with the power issue. So there is a general tendency in the historiography of South Asia, starting really very much in the 19th century, in the second half of the 19th century, to talk about the social geography and environment of India as being divided between Hindus and Muslims. Now, this is a trend that started earlier and can be traced back maybe into the 18th century, but it became much more profound and more intensely felt in India in the latter part of the 19th century. You just have to look at the work of, say, for example, Sandhya Freitag or Gyan Pandey in order to illustrate this fact. And this tendency moved on through the 20th century. You see a communalization of the history and identity in Sindh, intensely so, in the course of the first half of the 20th century, ultimately culminating in partition. Now, a lot of those Sindhis, I like to call them diaspora Sindhis, who left Sindh after partition, have increasingly identified themselves as quote-unquote Hindu Sindhis. Now, one of the difficulties of this particular identification of these groups as Hindu Sindhis really has to do with the sort of religious genealogy and history and sociocultural practices of these communities. As most Sindhis will be able to tell you, their religious practices tend to focus and include the Guru Granth Sahib. And this is really important because it points back to a history that takes many of these Hindu/diaspora Sindhis back to the Punjab. So a lot of these groups are not particularly orthodox Hindus in the traditional sense that we would consider. And in fact, they have a genealogy that points back to Sikhism or Sikhism. A lot of them are, in fact, historically what we call Nanak Panthis, or followers of Guru Nanak, that is, non-Khalsa Sikhs or Sikhs. Now, this history is particularly important because it points toward the origin stories for many diaspora Sindhis or quote-unquote Hindu Sindhis. Many of the communities that were forced to flee during and after partition, or many of the individuals that were forced to flee Sindh during partition and after partition, have genealogies that take them back not to Mohenjo-daro or even to medieval Sindh, but rather to the Punjab and the twilight of the Mughal Empire there. In the Punjab, we had a situation in the 18th century with the demise of the Mughal imperial state, and we see the rise of the Jats and under the banner of the Khalsa. Now, what we have going on in this part of India during the 18th century is in fact increasing violence that actually pits different kinds of Sikh or Sikh communities against each other. So it was Mughal imperial policy during this particular period to promote particular non-Khalsa, non-Jat caste groups, particularly Khatri. And these were largely urban administrative castes. And so if you see the look at the violence in the 19th or in the 18th century in the Punjab with the disintegration of the Mughal Empire and the rise of the Sikh states or Sikh states or state, what you observe is a large amount of urban rural violence that inevitably is involving Jat and Khatri violence also. Now, what we have during this time period is the Punjab becoming an increasingly hostile place for urban as well as for administrative groups associated or attached to the Mughal imperial structure. We have at this same time the Mughal imperial structure having dissolved already to the south of the Punjab in Sindh, and the development and opening up of successor states in this particular time period. Now, the combination of the violence going on in Punjab during the 18th century with the establishment of the Khalsa and other Sikh states dominated by Jats, you have in fact trading as well as government employment opportunities in more stable regions to the south of the Punjab in Sindh. And this was in fact an incredible draw for certain caste groups, particularly Khatris, who moved and migrated from the Punjab into Sindh during the 18th century. Now, a lot of these particular groups were then subsequently integrated, if you will, into the local or into the regional social structural categories in Sindh, particularly amongst the Lohana group. So the Lohana is a social category that can be traced back through the medieval period, but one that had been depopulated, if you will, as Lohanas converted to Islam and to other faiths. Now, traditionally associated with mercantile and merchant groups, what happened was that these groups coming in from the Punjab to the north were integrated into the Lohana social category. And as a result, found themselves integrated in a sort of grab bag category with a lot of other individuals. Now, what this means is that as a result of this particular set of migrations, which were particularly noticeable and intense in the 18th century, is that a lot of individuals who self-identify now as quote-unquote Hindu Sindhis, in fact, have genealogies that trace back to this migration in the 18th century. And a lot of them are, in fact, as I said before, Nanakpantis. And they are not, strictly speaking, Orthodox Hindus in that way. And this is, again, why you see a variety of social and religious practices among Sindhis, which have genealogies that trace back to Sikhism. As I mentioned before, the Guru Granth Sahib is a particularly important element in many Hindu Sindhi temples, and even the fact that Punjabi is not an uncommon name among Sindhis. So it's a bit of a misnomer to self-identify these groups as Hindu Sindhis within the context of the colonial and pre-colonial period. It's a much more appropriate term to use for the post-partition period. But as you shift back in time, as it is the case with many social categories, it becomes more difficult to sustain the identity over time. Now, on the second part of the question about the power of Hindu minorities in colonial and pre-colonial Sindh, the question of minority, these groups, whether or not you call them Nanakpantis or whether or not you identify them as Hindus, is in fact a very complicated question too. So if you look at the sort of entirety of the population of Sindh, yes, these groups, Hindus or Nanakpantis, Lohana, were minorities. But they're only minorities in the context of taking the population as a whole. So if you disaggregate the population on urban versus rural categories, you see a slightly different story. So groups, in fact, Hindu groups or Nanakpantis or Lohanas, non-Muslims, if you will, it's probably a better way to put it, were always a minority in the rural sectors of Sindh. Now, this, however, if we follow the work of Alan Jones, was not always the case in the urban centers of India. And in fact, there's a number of situations where Hindu or Nanakpanti Lohana groups occupied the majority of the population in the urban centers. And this is exactly why it is that many of these particular groups had very powerful positions within the urban centers of Sindh. They occupied and controlled, for example, the institutions of social and political importance in Sindh's urban centers. They also occupied the positions, economic positions of power as mediators of the rural economy with the wider world. So to talk about Hindus as being a minority in Sindh is true in one sense. But if you look at it a little more deeply, what you end up finding is, in fact, a more complicated story that tells different stories based on whether or not you're discussing rural Sindh, whether or not you're discussing urban Sindh, or whether or not you're talking about the population as an entirety or as a whole for the region. Now, in addition to the complications that go into the question about whether or not the amount of power that Hindu minorities had in colonial and pre-colonial Sindh, one has to also address this issue of power. I just sort of looked at it quickly and glossed at it. with reference to the urban influence or the influence of non-Muslims in urban Sindh in the colonial and pre-colonial period. It is definitely the case that non-Muslim, be they Lohana or be they Nanakpantis or Hindus in pre-colonial and colonial Sindh were far from powerless. It is often the case, if you look at the literature in the 19th century, particularly the British literature in the 19th century, that these minority groups, particularly Hindus, were marked as oppressed minorities in Sindh. And this was used ideologically by the colonial state in order to justify the annexation of Sindh in the 1840s. Now, if you actually get into the sources, the local sources and the regional sources that are available in different parts of the world, you find that this story about the oppressed minority Hindus in Sindh is a little more complicated. And the plain fact of the matter is that in colonial as well as in pre-colonial Sindh, at least starting in the 18th century, quote-unquote Hindu groups, for example, Naomuls and Bhaibands, who are in fact members, subgroups of the Lahana, occupied particularly important positions of power in pre-colonial as well as in colonial Sindh. Naomuls had a monopoly, if you will, on the power of the state. In the pre-colonial period, they were the state administrators, I should say, of the Amir's states. They were, in fact, as I say in my book, the officers of despotism rather than the Amirs themselves. The Bhaiband, in contrast, had a lock on the power of capital in colonial Sindh, as well as in pre-colonial Sindh. So these two particular very powerful minority groups, who would now self-identify as being Hindus, were far from powerless. They controlled two really important elements of power in pre-colonial Sindh, both the political power, that is, of the state, through the administration and through Naomuls, and the power of capital and the power of money in colonial and pre-colonial Sindh. So I would make the argument that Hindu minorities in colonial and pre-colonial Sindh were nowhere near as powerless or in need of saving by the colonial state, and thereby requiring the annexation of Sindh in the 1840s, than the colonial sources make them out to be. So let me answer this in a couple ways. Let me take a look at the sort of pre-colonial story, because that's what I know best from my own research, and then sort of gloss and a little bit and look towards the colonial era to answer that. So I guess what you're interested in me answering is what did these groups deal in? Where was it coming from? To whom did they sell? And these sorts of questions about the commodities. Well, during the pre-colonial period, so we're talking about 1840s, before the 1840s, it's very difficult to tell exactly. And one of the reasons for this is the nature of the kinds of source materials that we have for the sort of pre-middle of the 19th century. In the 1850s, the British decided that the Persian source records, government records in Sindh, were of no use to them, and they destroyed all of them. So what that means is that a lot of what we have in terms of information about commodities, trade, and these sorts of things are all filtered through the East India Company archive and the priorities of the East India Company and its various officers at this given time. So a lot of what we do know about this particular period in the pre-colonial period is a little speculative. But what I can say is this, is that most of the business practices engaged in by various Bhaiband or Hindu traders was all attached to the agrarian economy in Sindh. During this period and a lot of periods, the agrarian economy in South Asia is particularly important. South Asia still is largely agrarian in nature. And the place where sovereigns were able to extract the most wealth in the forms of taxes was always from the agrarian production. So a lot of the trade and economy in Sindh, as well as across South Asia during the 19th century and before, and for many centuries previous to this, was all tied up with issues of agrarian production. So we do know, in fact, that Hindu merchant traders or Bhaibands were deeply involved in the grain markets and in the moving around of grain and purchasing of grain and selling of grain. We also know that a lot of them were involved in the financing side of things. So there was a large range of activity going all the way from smaller grain merchants all the way to sort of large business houses that had diversified business interests, including financing for various different projects. But a lot of this financing and a lot of the activities that these Hindu merchants were in fact involved in were rotated around the agrarian economy in Sindh in some way or another. And this is consistent with the social experience in South Asia in general during this particular time period. I think in order to answer this particular question, you need to ask another question. And that is, a traitor to what? Was Naomul a traitor to Pakistan? I think it becomes very difficult to sustain that position, merely because the idea of Pakistan as a polity wasn't particularly at play during the middle of the 19th century. As a concept, it developed rather late in the period leading up to partition in the 20th century. And I just direct you towards the work of David Gilmartin on the idea of Pakistan in order to get a better sense of that newness of the concept as it developed over the 20th century. So it's difficult, I think, to make the argument that Naomul was a traitor to Pakistan when in fact, the idea of Pakistan really wasn't at play or in existence in any meaningful way during Naomul's life. I guess if you could also argue that, and ask the question, was Naomul a traitor to Sindh? This is also a problematic sort of argument to make in my view, because the plain fact of the matter is that Sindh as a sort of unified, coherent nation or nationality and or polity really in fact came into more clear being over the course of the 19th century. Because if you remember, in the pre-colonial or pre-annexation period, Sindh, the geographical region that we now call Sindh, was in fact divided up into various semi-independent sovereignties. Khairpur was one large one, the Mirs of Hyderabad and Mirpur. There were three different houses, and even the largest and most powerful of these groups, the Mirs or the Baluchistani Talpurs of Hyderabad, they actually ran their state in a rather decentralized way. They're called the Chariyar, or Four Friends. So the plain fact of the matter is that as a unified polity, it's very difficult to talk about Sindh as this during the course, or at least during the course of the first half of the 19th century. Now, Sindh as a political and social unit and national identity as Sindhis becomes much more coherent in the course of the 19th century. But the problem is then you're taking social categories that occur after Naomul's life and using them to apply them to his actions in a more earlier time period. So it's hard for me to conceptualize Naomul as a traitor to Sindh, given the fact that the region didn't have quite the same coherent polity and sort of national identity that developed later on after his death, starting in the latter part of the 19th century and becoming much more clear through the course of the 20th century. Well, it's safe to say that the impact of annexation by the East India Company and the subsequent colonial rule of South Asia through the 19th century had a rather uneven impact on Sindh. In some domains, the changes that were brought by colonialism and the annexation were felt much more intensely than in other areas. So, for example, if you look in the domain of agrarian social structure and power relations, it's easy to make the argument that the impact of colonialism was, in fact, not so sharply felt by many at the local level. Now, the reason for this has to do with actions of Charles Napier in 1843 or 1844. Where he essentially called in all of the landowners, all the zamindars, wederos, jagidars, to come to a big durbar and to essentially reaffirm their alliance, or their allegiance, I should say, to the British colonial state and to the East India Company in lieu of the amirs. And what he ended up doing was merely reaffirming all of the land holdings and all the rights to collect taxes and ownership of land that had previously existed. Now, this caused a lot of confusion for the British because one of the major sources of revenue for the East India Company state was the taxation of agrarian produce. And if, as Napier did, the company merely just reaffirmed all of the titles and rights to the product of the land on the part of the indigenous elite, the East India Company had little to no knowledge of actually what the economic fecundity of this particular region was or wasn't. And in fact, it took them a long time to sort this all out. The first printed land settlement work, comprehensive, wasn't done until the 1860s. They started working on it in the 1840s to clear up these roles about who owned what. And the reason for this, of course, was because agrarian taxation was one of the most important things, sources of income that the East India Company had at this given time. Now, what this all has meant is that a number of different historians who have done some very excellent work have made the argument, and I think that can be sustained, that in fact the impact on the agrarian social structure of British colonialism in Sindh was relatively light, and what they had was a policy of ruling the elites and not actually ruling particularly directly. And in part, this was a reason because they didn't have the kind of knowledge that was required for that kind of direct local on-the-ground rule as a result of Napier coming in and just reaffirming all the rights and privileges of the indigenous landowners in Sindh following the annexation of the region. Now, having said that, if you take a look at the domain of social structure in agrarian Sindh, you can make the argument that the impact of the East India Company sociopolitically wasn't that great on the ground. You can look at other domains and make the argument that in fact it was quite transformative in its nature. Sindh became a sort of more singular unit, administrative and political unit, in a way that it hadn't been before. So prior to annexation in 1843, Sindh had been divided into sort of three semi-independent kingdoms ruled by three different amirs. This whole situation was washed away, and the entire region was subsequently put under Napier as a governor who reported directly to the Governor General in Calcutta. In 1847, the situation changed. Sindh was put under a commissioner who reported directly to the governor of Bombay, who then reported to the Governor General in Calcutta. But the whole point that I want to make with this is, regardless of both of these issues, or both of these time periods, the period between 1843 and 1847, or after 1847, was that Sindh developed a much more sort of singular political structure and administrative structure. And this was a great transformation. It gave it a certain sense of unity that allowed people to begin imagining themselves as part of a particular singular, not only polity, but I dare say nation. And we see this sort of development of the idea of a more coherent Sindhi national identity developing in the latter part of the 19th century, in part as a result of its integration into the British Empire. And we see, for example, this in the area of script. Prior to the British annexation of Sindh, Sindhis wrote the Sindhi language in a whole variety of different scripting systems. And when the British came in, they said, no, this isn't going to work. And to sort of, gloss over a very complicated debate, the British colonial state decided that Sindhi would be written in one script, and that would be in Naskh, which is, the Arabic script. And what this did was provide a more singular, if you will, way to communicate, a more singular way of understanding themselves as Sindhis. It gave them a more unified language and scripting system in which to base a more unified, or to imagine themselves, if you will, as part of a more unified national identity. And this particular development was very much a result of decision-making that was within the British colonial state. Now, the British colonial state, say for example on this scripting issue, did consult indigenous, quote-unquote, experts. In the case of the fixing of the encodification of the script, what happened was that this these indigenous consultants, there was an indigenous committee that was set up, and they attempted, in fact, to make suggestions and modifications to the form of Naskh that the British colonial state had decided was going to be the writing system for the Sindhi language. And they submitted a report to the commissioner, Bertil Frere, at the time, in the early part of the 1850s. And Bertil Frere's response was to them that you have misunderstood your position. Your position is merely to suggest indigenous texts that we can put into this script and thereby train our British colonial officers to become fluent in the Sindhi language. It is not your job, this was said to the Indigenous Committee of Experts, to make suggestions about or improvements on this script that we have decided following the suggestions of Richard Burton. So we have a situation here, I think, in which you can quite directly show how the impact of the British colonial experience and that of annexation, the East India Company, was very profound on the sort of sociocultural life of many Sindhis. And that is the choice and decision to write the Sindhi language in Naskh is directly related to decisions on the part of the British colonial state following the annexation in 1845. And I believe the final decision on the Naskh issue was in 1855 or 1856. And this was a profound transformation that increasingly allowed Sindhis to think of themselves and communicate with a unitary or in a singular script, and thereby think of themselves increasingly as a singular nation or sort of identity, or imagine themselves as a more singular identity. I'm going to sort of answer this through the sphere of research that I know best, which is the annexation. The British became increasingly interested in Sindh throughout the course of the 19th century. Now, a lot of this is not necessarily attached to economic interests, but to political interests. But having said that, the British often framed, and the East India Company often framed its imperial interests in terms of economics. So, for example, if you look at the British literature in the 19th century on the issue of Sindh, you find a lot of individuals talking about the importance of free trade. This was consistent with the British Empire sort of across the world as well as in South Asia, this emphasis on free trade. And the idea, of course, was of opening up the Indus River, which some, like Eastwick, described as a kind of Nile-like paradise. Opening it up to free trade, thereby also gaining access to, or potential access to, markets in Central Asia. Now, of course, this was only part of the story, and free trade is often wielded in the first part of the 19th century, actually throughout the 19th century and to some degree even today, as a tool for justifying imperial expansion and interventions. In reality, one of the things that the British were interested in with regard to Sindh was to attempt to check what they viewed as a threat to their imperial sovereignty in South Asia by the Russians, who had been expanding their influence throughout Central Asia during the course of the 19th century. So the annexation and interest in Sindh on the part of the East India Company and the British is in many ways a byproduct of what they call the Great Game of imperial cat and mouse that was occurring in Central Asia and other places, Persia amongst others also, between the British Empire and the Russian Empire. So the interests in the East India Company in Sindh, while often expressed in terms of an economic interest and desire to expand free trade in the Indus and Central Asia, in fact had a very profound and important political dynamic attached to the Great Game and the competition for imperial power between the East India Company, representing the British Empire, and the Russian Empire. Now, having said that, let me also say that the British were interested in South Asia for economic reasons that were not attached to free trade either. And I'm thinking of the scholarship of Wong here, who wrote a very interesting article some years ago about how the British were in fact interested in annexing Sindh and extending their influence into Sindh, not for free trade purposes, but for the opposite of that, for closing down trading opportunities. For those of you who are familiar with the history of South Asia and the East India Company in the 19th century, you'll know that it's a history of increasingly restricted monopolies. So in the Charter Act of 1832, what you see is the major constriction on the commodities and goods that the company is allowed to have a monopoly on. Now, this leads to a couple of different things. One, it leads to an ever more interest in the company in acquiring land, because land taxes on agrarian products were not excluded in the Charter Act as a domain from which the company could extract wealth and taxes. As a result, you see in the period after 1832 Charter Act an increasing territorial expansion of direct rule by the East India Company in South Asia. And the reason for that was that it was one of the few areas, land taxes, was one of the few areas in which the company still had control over as an important source of revenue. Now, the other part of this story, the 1832 Charter Act excluded opium from competition and from free trade. Opium was still a monopoly held by the East India Company. Now, Wong argues that the East India Company was interested in extending their influence and ultimately annexing Sindh as a result of wanting to shut down, not promote, trade routes for opium that competed with those of the East India Company. So Wong's article is very much explicit in terms of saying, in fact, the company's interest in company's interest in Sindh had nothing to do with free trade, as many of their documents or public documents stated, but for exactly the opposite reason. They wanted to cut down on trading opportunities in a particular commodity that they retained a monopoly upon, and that was opium. And it was particularly important for the company to shut down competing trade routes for opium to China. And the reason for this was, as I mentioned, the sources of income for the company after the Charter Act of 1832 were increasingly restricted. And land taxes over the territory that it ruled directly was one area that it was dependent upon to finance itself, and the other area, of course, was opium production and sale of opium to China in particularly. You know, the 1840s is a period in which we have the Opium Wars, which were wars fought by the company in order to protect its right to keep Chinese addicted to opium, a product that it was producing in South Asia. So the question is about the term Bhaiband, which is the sort of indigenous social category that's used to talk about Hindu traders and merchants of Sindh, and what the origin of the term is. It's a wonderful question. I don't have a definitive sort of statement or conclusion on that I can share with you. However, I can say a couple of different things that I think are relevant to understanding the term and what it tells us about the broader sort of sociocultural geography of Sindh as a region. The term itself, if you look at the etymology of the word, is broken down into two sections. One is, of course, Bhai, which is the common Sanskrit-derived and Hindi word for brother, and Band. Now, the Band part of this, it comes from bandhana, or to tie, or to bring together. So, quite literally, the translation of this is the tying together of brothers. And that's why the term Bhaiband has often been translated as brotherhood. Now, what's important about this term, as you'll have already maybe gathered from what I just said, is that it comes as a marker of socio-cultural identity out of the Sanskrit-based linguistic traditions. All right? Now, what's important here is that some of the other sort of key, quote-unquote, Hindu groups of colonial and pre-colonial Sindh have histories of terminology that are in fact very different. So if we take, for example, a look at the other major dominant group in colonial and pre-colonial Sindh of non-Muslims, these would be the Naomuls. So we have a situation in colonial and pre-colonial Sindh. It was dominated, or I should say, the area of capital and wealth was very much dominated by Bhaiband traders. They controlled the power of capital. On the other hand, you had a group called the Naomils, who controlled the power of the state. Now, the genealogy for the term Naomil, of course, comes out of the Persian tradition and refers to the Mughal administrative category of Amal, not A-M-I-L, but rather A-M-A-L. This is a Persian term to refer to government administrator and was a term that in fact was used in the Mughal administration. So what we have here is a really fascinating example of the two moieties, two dominant moieties of the quote-unquote Hindu community in colonial and pre-colonial Sindh having somewhat different genealogies, although both of them were part of a more larger umbrella group called the Lahana. Genealogies for the moieties terms that they call themselves that point one to a Indo-Persian genealogy and one that points, in fact, to a sort of more Sanskrit linguistic terminology. And what's interesting about this is the accommodation of both of these sorts of traditions under a sort of singular category. And what it points towards is that traditional kind of ease, that sociocultural ease and mix that has traditionally throughout, at least up through the 20th century, characterized the sociocultural condition of Sindh, where these sort of hardened and fast identity categories based on communal understandings of history between Hindus versus Muslims don't really particularly hold very well. And I think the term Bhaiband, with its sort of glancing towards the Sanskrit linguistic tradition, and the Naomuls, with their term and that category glancing towards the sort of Indo-Islamic and Persian tradition under one singular community category, the Lahana points to this sort of easy mixing and flowing across these hardened religious boundaries that only became hardened religious boundaries much later in the 19th century and leading up to partition in the 20th century. So while I don't have an exact answer on the origin of the idea of the Bhaiband, what it does point to, I think, is some very important, interesting facts about the nature of sociocultural life and the fluidity of certain religious categories and practices as sociocultural categories during the colonial and pre-colonial period. So let me roll this question back a little bit and talk not historically but anthropologically, particularly about the competition and the relationship and the hierarchies of social power among the Lahana in pre-colonial Sindh. As I mentioned previously, the Lahana are an overarching sociocultural category, a sociocultural category that's been in existence in Sindh at least back through the medieval period. And if you're interested in the early histories of this category, I suggest you read Daryl McLean's work on medieval Sindh and the Arab invasions. Now, what happened following the Arab invasions, as Daryl McLean illustrates, there was a depopulation of this particular social category. And as increasing numbers of migrants came into Sindh in the twilight of the Mughal Empire in the Punjab, and those groups migrated looking for economic opportunities and employment opportunities in Sindh and in the successor states during the 18th century, you had these groups being integrated into the Lahana category. Now, over some time, many of these groups who were coming and migrating in the course of the 18th century were Khatris. Khatris with experience in government administration. And so we see a development, a bifurcation of the Lahana community into two separate endogamous moieties. One that's based on the pursuit of the power of capital, those would be the Bhaibands, and those who rotated their identity around the pursuit of the power of the state, and those would be Naomuls. Now, within the Lahana category, these two increasingly endogamous groups, that's not to say that there weren't in fact sometimes intermarriages between these two groups, but they became increasingly, if you will, less common. And in part, that's because marriage in South Asia is a marker of social distinction and status. So it occurs all throughout South Asia and even in Sindh, as you'll see in this example, that one way that you mark your distinction as being separate, either being superior hierarchically or inferior hierarchically from another group, is by allowing marriage alliances or not allowing marriage alliances. So we have a situation in Sindh of Bhaibands and Naomuls becoming increasingly endogamous, and a distinction, a status distinction, subsequently happening, where Naomuls began considering themselves, because of their association with the state, as being of higher social status and standing than Bhaibands. And this is a social distinction within the community that even till today continues to varying degrees. Although, to be honest with you, partition has helped obliterate some of this power distinction between Amals and Bhaibans and status within the Lahana community. However, during the colonial and pre-colonial periods, it's important not to sort of read back the post-colonial into the colonial. This distinction between being Amal and being Bhaiban was very profoundly understood. And the distinction of Amals as being, quote unquote, superior or more sophisticated and more educated than Bhaibans, and looking down upon them was something profoundly felt within the social dynamics and interactions among Sindhis who are of the Lahana category. Now, one of the things about Naomul was that he, in fact, used his close association with the British colonial state, with the East India Company, in many ways to become an Amal. He was, this was recognized when he was given an official government position as Deputy Khadar of Karachi. So Naomul's close relationship with the East India Company in many ways had little to do with being a traitor. A traitor to what, as I mentioned earlier, is a big question, but rather using and understanding the social hierarchies of his community to transform himself from being exclusively Bhaiband and increasingly appropriating an Amal status. Now, this, if you will, attempt to invert the social hierarchies between Amals and Bhaibans within the Lahana community increasingly developed or encountered pushback from Amals, who were initially distanced because of their strong association with the Amir states as the Amir states, quote-unquote, officers of despotism. And the company, however, ultimately had a shift in priorities in the 1840s, away from a need to finance colonial expansion and ergo a close relationship with wealthy Hindu traders like Naomul, and towards a need to administer a colonial state. And what you see during this time period of the 1840s and through the 1850s is a shifting of alliances away by the colonial state and the East India Company, away from Bhaibans like Naomul and towards the Amals. As this shift happened, it put Bhaibans like Naomul and others in a very awkward position, where they were in fact resulted in a backlash by Amals against Bhaibans for having stepped out of their social category and having tried to disrupt or invert the power relations between Amals and Bhaibans, by Bhaibans using their close association with the East India Company to essentially become Amals. And what we see during this period is opportunities opening up for Bhaibans. As this sort of backlash is happening, economic opportunities opening up for Bhaibans in other parts of the British Empire. One of the things about being a citizen of the empire was that you had the right to travel and settle in alternative locations within the empire. So you see the opening up of opportunities for Bhaibans in the British Empire at a time and place in which the emphasis and close relationship between Bhaibans and the British colonial state was shifting away from them and away from a need to finance the expansion of the British colonial state in Sindh towards the need to administer it, and a shift away from Bhaibans and a shift toward political alliances with Amals, reintegrating themselves into the structures of power and administration in the post-annexation period. So you can actually sort of read the origins of the beginnings of the Sindhi diaspora in the 18th century, or part of the diaspora in the 18th century. Of course, Markovitz has done some really wonderful work on this that sort of predate the middle of the 19th century. But you can peg it to this internal debate and attempt by Bhaibans to invert the social structures and hierarchies between them and Amals within the broader Lahana category. So there's an actual profound relationship between conflict between various indigenous groups in Sindh, particularly the Naomuls and Bhaibands in the post-annexation period, and the expansion of the Sindhi diaspora starting in the middle of the 19th century. Well, Sindhworkis are in fact a type of Bhaiband. Now, the Bhaibands, as I mentioned before, generally have historically rotated their sense of identity around a pursuit of capital power. Within that particular social category, there was a hierarchy based on wealth. At the higher end of the Bhaiband community, you had very wealthy financiers who were capitalists, if you will, involved in many different kinds of business. All the way down to, on the local level, Bhaibands who were engaged in much smaller forms of capitalist behavior, grain merchants, for example. One of these sort of smaller, less affluent Bhaiband groups were individuals and families who took to trading in traditional Sindhi arts and crafts, or what was called by the British Sindh work. These were arts and crafts which were in fact not produced by quote-unquote Hindus, but by Muslim artisans in Sindh, and that were taken as a domain of economic trade which became dominated by a particular group of Bhaibands, who then subsequently got identified by the British and then appropriated this terminology to talk about themselves as Sindhworkis. Some of the first Bhaiband groups to leave Sindh were in fact members of these Sindhworki groups who peddled and sold in various retail and stores various products of Sindh. And as a result, some of the first, if you will, members of the sort of post-annexation Sindhi diaspora were these Bhaibands called Sindhworkis, who went out to other parts of the British Empire, which they could now, as citizens of the empire, settle in order to make and establish new lives for them following the annexation of Sindh and following the sort of rotting of internal relations between Bhaibands and Naomuls that I discussed earlier in the post-annexation period. Now, the first sort of Sindhis in this post-annexation period to migrate were not the large-scale, wealthy Bhaiband financiers. These, in fact, were sort of lower groups of less affluent means. And this is actually a pattern of behavior which is, of course, consistent across the British Empire in general. Many of the people who were involved, for example, individuals who were involved in the expansion of the British Empire and the settlement of the British Empire were not, if you will, from the elite echelons of British society. Nor was this the fact with, for example, Sindhis. Very few Naomuls who considered themselves the elite strata of Sindhi society initially took advantage of these opportunities of being citizens of empire to establish themselves in businesses in foreign locales, Southeast Asia or East Asia, Hong Kong, Jakarta, Singapore, and places like this. So this is a general sort of pattern that's consistent with behavior across the empire, where you had Sindhworkis who were lower echelon, less wealthy, less well-off Bhaibands, taking opportunities to migrate within the geography of the British Empire to establish and make new lives for themselves elsewhere, outside of their homeland. And as I said, in many ways, this is consistent even with the behavior of the British who came to South Asia themselves for similar reasons to look for opportunities. The colonizers who often came to South Asia were often not the elite cream of British society. Same story with Sindhworkis. They were Bhaibands, but they were not of the wealthy, high, if you will, class or classes, be they Naomuls or being the more wealthy Bhaibands who dominated trade and capital exchanges in colonial and pre-colonial Sindh.